Good morning, Kairos. This is Andrea. I'm going to be speaking to you today. We're continuing the Prophet in You series with modern day prophets. I am going to be speaking about a modern day prophetess of my generation, someone that's had a very big impact on my life. In fact, as I'm sitting here ready to speak, I'm a little uncomfortable because I feel like I'm bearing my soul. Spiritually speaking, it feels like I'm sitting here naked. There's nothing to hide after this. This is me in this teaching. This is something. I'm 43 and I was 18 when this happened, and it still hits close to home, even after all these years. For my mom's generation, most of the people in this room, one of the big touchstones for your generation was November 22nd, 1963. That's a date that's frozen in time. I bet and I've heard most of the people in this room, with the exception of one, say exactly what they were doing on that day, because it is frozen in your mind. It's a moment in time that you never forget. For me, and for others in my generation, April 20th, 1999 is a day like that. I can tell you exactly what I was doing. I remember that day perfectly. It was a Tuesday. It was a beautiful day. I was in college. I was going to Pellissippi State in Knoxville at the Hardin Valley campus. I commuted from Lenore City. Tuesdays and Thursdays were early days. I got off early, around maybe 2 or 2:30. I remember coming home. I was going to fix myself a little snack and then start studying. I have to have noise in the background to study. I'm strange. And a lot of times I would turn on the news or I would turn on the TV. So, fixed myself a snack, came in, turned on the TV, and was absolutely horrified at what I saw. That was the day of the Columbine school shooting. I remember sitting there frozen because they thought that nobody knew for a long time how many people were dead. I can remember Tom Brokaw in his coverage said they estimated 50 to 100. They didn't know. You have these images of kids pouring out of the school, their hands behind their heads, SWAT bringing them out. It's just unbelievable. That day was a day that changed my generation's heart. It should have changed this nation. It should have had more impact than it did. Prophets and prophetesses don't choose the message they bring, do they? God gives them their message. God gives them their voice. Some prophets in the Bible were lucky enough to speak about the coming of the Messiah, of Jesus. And that was their message. Some were bringers of doom and destruction. They didn't choose that. It was the voice, it was the message they were given. They were given a message of doom for their nation. The destruction of Israel, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of their life, and being carried off into captivity. Nobody likes to hear those messages. Probably why Jeremiah is probably the least popular. In the last 10 years, I've not heard a single sermon uttered from that book. But we need people like Jeremiah, because in those messages that are hard to hear is repentance. It breaks down your pride. It breaks down that spirit. It can break down walls. And if you're smart and you're a Christian, you embrace those moments, because those are the moments of growth. Those are the moments where God can really move in your heart and life and work and do a miraculous work. I want to talk to you about Rachel Scott. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cassie Bernal, but mostly Rachel Scott. Rachel Scott was 15 months younger than me. I was born May 1st, 1980. She was born August 5th, 1981. She, the morning of August 20th, was getting up, getting ready for school. Her mom tells in a book about her life, Rachel's Tears, how she would always come in every morning after she got dressed, and she would want to use her mom's makeup to get ready for school, because she never knew where her makeup was. I can hear that. It was probably in her car, it was probably at a friend's house, it was probably strewn here, strewn there. She would just go in and use her mom's. She and her mom had this little routine they would go through every morning. They would banter back and forth. Rachel would be the nagging, imperious mother figure, and Beth, her mother, would be the flighty, spoiled teenager, and they would have fun with that. And usually her sister or one of her brothers would walk in, and it would just sort of go from there. That morning was indelibly ingrained into her mind. She says she remembers how beautiful Rachel looked that morning. She said that she had never looked more beautiful than she did that morning. And one of the last things Rachel said before she left, before she and her brother Craig left for school, was, "Oh, Mom, I don't know what I'm going to do with you anymore. I can't take care of you anymore. I just don't know what I'm going to do with you." She kissed her. They said their goodbyes, and she left. And her two children, Rachel's younger brother Craig, there were 5 kids in that family: Bethany, Dana, Rachel, Craig, and Michael. Craig rode with Rachel to school every morning in her little red Acura Legend. He was 16. When they got to school and they walked in and they parted ways in ways they never, I don't think either one of them ever imagined, because by the end of that day, Rachel was dead. And Craig would walk out of that school. He would go into that school, a 16-year-old boy full of dreams and thinking about things that teenage boys think about, and he would come back out later that day like a veteran who had been to war, who had seen the worst in a battlefield situation. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold killed 12 students that day and 1 teacher. Rachel and a guy she was sitting with outside the building just near the entrance to the library were sitting having lunch when they walked up and just started firing. Based on the accounts, and with everything that's happened this week with Israel, I was going to get a little bit more detailed into the shooting and talk more about that, but I'll be honest with you, psychologically and mentally, I can't go there right now, mentally, because that is so dark. And this week, there's enough darkness in this week, I just want to focus on Rachel, but I do want to hit on the points that concern her, and concern Craig, and concern Cassie. They unloaded. Richard Castaldo was hit over 9 times. He was paralyzed. He's paralyzed to this day from the waist down. He survived. Rachel was hit in her arm, her leg, and her torso, and was trying to crawl away when Eric Harris walked up to her, grabbed her by her hair, lifted her head up. He and Dylan Klebold spent several minutes taunting her because they knew she was a Christian. I'll explain that a little bit later, but they knew that. Eric Harris asked her, he said, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, "You know I do." And then he said, "Go be with him." And he shot her in the head, execution style, and she was dead. After they left, they went into the library, and that was where Craig was. Craig was sitting at one of the tables, studying with two of his friends, Isaiah Scholes and Matthew Kechter, both killed in the shootings. They heard what they thought were firecrackers or something popping. They didn't think it was guns until a teacher ran in and said, "Everybody get down, people are shooting guns." They got under the table they were sitting at. They heard the shooters come in, and one of them said, I'm not sure which one, "Get anybody with a white hat." Craig had on a white hat. He took his hat off and stuffed it in his shirt. Isaiah Scholes was one of the few African American students in that school, and one of the shooters saw him and said racial slurs, pointed him out. The other shooter came back. They taunted him for a few minutes, harassed him, said things, horrible things to that boy before they shot him. Matthew Kechter was involved in sports. They hated jocks. They shot him. Somehow, between Isaiah and Matthew was Craig. They didn't shoot Craig. Craig just laid there, paralyzed. They went around. They shot some other people. They came to Cassie Bernal and asked her if she believed in God. She said yes. One of them asked why. They didn't give her a chance to respond, and they killed her the same way they killed Rachel. Put their gun to her head and just killed her. Another girl was shot. She wasn't murdered. She was shot over 12 times and survived. Her name was Valine Schnur. They asked her if she believed in God. Other students and she, according to her own admission and her own witness, said she did, and they shot her, but she survived. After they left the library, they went down from the library and down to the cafeteria. During this whole time, Craig was praying. His family was very involved in church. He and his sister both. He was praying. And after they left, he said he heard God speak to him and say, "Get up and take as many people with you as you can now." So he got up and got as many students that were living or wounded as he could. One girl, he heard ask for his help. They had shot her in the arm, and part of her arm had been taken off. He helped her. He helped others. He and the kids that were still alive in that school got out of that library. And that was nothing but God. Because after Eric and Dylan went through the cafeteria and they went around in some of the halls, they came back up to the library. Nobody was there, and they killed themselves. His family describes that when they saw him, when they were finally able to make contact with him, he looked like a shell-shocked veteran. He looked like somebody that had been to war. I'm pleased to say, I don't know if do you ever really get past trauma? It's kind of like saying you had cancer. Do you ever really get past the fact that you had cancer? You overcome it. But you don't ever really forget that trauma. He's doing, I think, as well as can be expected. Better than most. His faith is a big part of that. And Rachel is a big part of that too. Rachel, when she was shot, one of the bullets went into her backpack and pierced a journal that she had in her backpack. So, after the killing, that backpack was held onto for quite a while because the police wanted to make sure, if there was a bullet in there, they wanted to investigate that. When her family finally got her backpack back and they opened up that journal, they were stunned. Because this 18-year-old girl who loved the Lord, who was very active in her school and in her church, had a real deep relationship with the Lord that nobody knew about. She didn't talk about it. She didn't tell anybody about it. But in her journal, and in the months after that, after her death, they found other journals too that she had kept since she was 10 or 11. She had a very deep, deep, deep relationship with the Lord that transcends what most people, what most mainline Christians my age have as a relationship with the Lord. Just an example of that. On April 20th, 1998, 1 year to the day before the shooting, she had journals that she kept with friends. One was her cousin Jeff. They kept a journal back and forth. That was popular in the 90s. I remember that. That was a thing. Kids at my school did that in Lemoore City. You would keep a journal, you would put a note in it, they would return it. It was, it was kind of cool. It was before Facebook. It was before any of that. And she had another friend named Sam that she kept a journal with. This is what she wrote on April 20th. Dear Sam, it's like I have a heavy heart and this burden upon my back, but I don't know what it is. There is something in me that makes me want to cry, and I don't even know what it is. Things have definitely changed. Last week was so hard. Besides missing Breakthrough, that was her church. That was a youth ministry she attended locally at a non-denominational church. Besides missing Breakthrough, I lost all of my friends at school. Now that I have begun to walk my talk, they make fun of me. I don't even know what I've done. I don't really have to say anything, and they turn me away. I have no more personal friends at school. But you know what? It's all worth it to me. I am not going to apologize for speaking the name of Jesus. I am not going to justify my faith in Him, and I am not going to hide the light that God has put into me. If I have to sacrifice everything, I will. I will take it. If my friends have to become my enemies for me to be with my best friend Jesus, then that's fine with me. I always thought part of being a Christian is having enemies. But I never thought that my friends were going to be those enemies. It's all good. I'm just a loner now at school. I just wish that someone from Breakthrough went to my school. Love always in Christ, Rachel Joy. A few days later, May 2nd of that same year, she wrote this in an untitled journal entry. This will be my last year, Lord. I've gotten what I can, thank you. She knew she had a year less to live. She knew that. She didn't tell a soul. Her parents didn't know. Her siblings didn't know. Her best friends didn't know. Her youth pastors didn't know. Nobody knew except her and God. And her journals, that was her voice. That was her way to God. In another untitled journal entry she wrote, just passing by, just coming through, not staying long, I always knew. This home I have will never last. When I was watching the stuff about the shooting on the news that day, I felt drawn to it. School shootings were nothing new for me and my generation. I remember one of the first ones was in 1993 when I was in 8th grade. I never really told my mom or anybody else this, but it's funny how you go to school and you wonder, am I going to die today? Is somebody going to come into my school? One of the people I pass by in my classes, somebody I sit with in lunch, somebody I see picked on. Are they going to come into class today? Are they going to shoot? Are they going to unload? kill us all. That was something that I lived with. And with every passing year, and every school shooting that happened, and every one seemed to get more violent, I remember that dread just growing. I also remember wondering, I was like, Lord, is it going to get to the point to where people are killed in schools because they love you? I just remember, I don't remember when it was, but I remember asking the Lord that one day when I was praying. I was by myself. I remember saying, are people going to be killed for you in this? You didn't answer. But I wondered about that. I remember when they released the names of all the victims the next day. When my mom came home from work, we both sat and watched it. I did my homework, but I was sitting there listening, watching, doing that. And when the names were released and it showed each of the pictures, I remember when it showed Rachel's picture, and I felt something in my spirit kind of connect with that. I was like, oh, she looks nice. I don't know, there was just a connection there. I felt something in my spirit connect with her. And then, on Saturday, her family had her funeral, and her funeral was aired on CNN, and I remember watching that funeral. And what's funny about her funeral in 1998, Princess Diana's funeral was on CNN. Year before that, I watched that funeral too. More people viewed Rachel Scott's funeral on CNN than Princess Diana. And over 10 million people watched Princess Diana's. See, her funeral it was international. There were people in the Middle East. They said there was a small viewership of Rachel's funeral in the Middle East too. And I heard about what a sweet person she was. She was involved in drama. She had recently starred in the school play. That was a big thing for her. She wanted to pursue that. According to her journals and her writings, she also wanted to maybe go into missions work, be a missionary, do something for the Lord. She was a mime. That was popular in youth groups in the 90s. Ray Boltz had 2 really big songs in Christian music that kids would mime to. Watch the Lamb and the Hammer. She did that. When Columbine had their annual talent show one year, she mimed to the Hammer. And coincidentally enough, her music didn't start on cue like it should at the beginning, but she was doing the mimes, she was doing the motions. When the music started, she was perfectly in sync with the music when it picked up. And because she did that, she got a standing ovation. Now, her father talks about how after that was over with, she ran backstage and was horrified. She was embarrassed a little bit because her music failed, and he was there to hug her and tell her she did good. She was mocked for that. That was one of the things I think that lost her friends at school. She reached out to kids who were bullied. There was a kid in her school who had, I think he had cerebral palsy, and he may have been autistic, had some issues, and he was bullied and picked on. And she had told them that they were going to go out on a date. They were going to go to a movie. The weekend they were supposed to go was the Saturday after she was killed, was the day of her funeral. And they never got to do that. Richard Castaldo was an atheist. And she had met him at school and was trying to reach out to him. And what's sad is a movie came out in 2015. I'm not a huge fan of it. It's okay. But when that movie came out, there was a lot of uproar and a lot of controversy about it. And he verified his story to an atheist news organization or whomever, like a podcast or something, that he was asked if he believed in God. After they killed Rachel, they walked over to him and he said no. He didn't believe in God. And he told them he believes that's the reason why he lived and she died. I think that's really sad. I've been praying for him through the years, that God would soften his heart in some way so that he could know Jesus, because that's something she really wanted. When it came out, what had happened, this book was released in 2000. May, I think it was after the 1-year anniversary. My mom bought it for me for my birthday because I told her I wanted to see it. I wanted to read it. And when I read it, I couldn't believe it. Because for most of my life, I'm not saying this in an arrogant or boastful way. I'm just speaking the truth. I can remember being 9, 10 years old, and my uncle who went to seminary would pull out his seminary books and he would try to read these things to my mom and my granny about the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of substantiate, the doctrine of justification, of propitiation. They didn't really get it, because those textbooks are not exactly written in a real world kind of way. The language is very stilted. I can remember being 9 years old and not necessarily understanding the meaning of every single word that he said, but I understood what he was saying. I understood it. I can remember reading books that he would give my mom, and I would sneak and get them and read them, because that's why she would get them. She didn't, she cared, but she was like, oh, can I borrow this book? He's like, sure, you can borrow that book. And she'd be like, here. And I'd go and try to read it, try to understand it, try to pick it apart. And I understood it. I kind of got it. I understood things like that as I grew as a teenager. I could get that. I could sit and I could have a conversation with somebody about about the outline of Revelation and understand the flow of Revelation. I could understand that. But when it came to the everyday, boots on the ground, shoe leather on the road, living of the Christian life, I had to work a little bit at that. And it bothered me, because I could sit and I could verbally pray for a few minutes, but I can't just sit and talk out loud to God for hours. I'm just not blessed that way. And that bothered me, because a lot of times I would talk and then I would start talking to God in my head, or I would want to write it, because there are times when I can write things that I could never say out loud. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I was like, God, what's wrong with me? Why can't I sit and talk to you? Why can't I just do that? Why do I have to do this? I thought there was something really wrong with me. It really bothered me. And when I read that book, I started reading her book, I understood it was okay. That was the way God made me. Maybe God didn't make me to be somebody that could sit and speak, continuously speak verbally for, 4 to 6 hours and pray nonstop. I've got a big mouth, but even I can't go that long. But I can sit and I can have conversations with God in my head. I can start praying when I'm speaking and finish it in my head. Or maybe I feel led to write, and I can do that. I've sat and I've written for hours things that I could never sit and say for hours. When I read that book, it was a gift to me. Because I understood that it wasn't the understanding all of this stuff about God. Yes, it's important to understand, to have good, sound theology and doctrine. I'm not denouncing that. That is important. But it's so much more important, I think, to know how to live your life as a Christian practically. Because if you understand what's written in books, but you can't translate that into a daily walk, there's a problem there. And she showed me, reading her journals, because it's full of things. It's not just full of doom and gloom. It's not just full of her thinking, her knowing she's going to die. She wrote all kinds of things. She would write songs to God. She would write prayers. She would seek God. And she would write things that I had thought. She would sit and she would say, God, are you real? If you're real, why can't I feel you? Why did you move yesterday and you're not moving now? What is it in me that's changed, Lord? Why? And she's 17 years old. And she's not talking about any of that. It's all going on in these journals. I connected with that. I also connected with her in a way, too, because she loved people who were bullied. High school was not the time of my life. If I could erase a time in my life, I would probably erase high school. I lost my grandmother. I lost my great aunt, who was like a grandmother. My grandmother was more like a second mom to me than a grandmom. I lost both of them. I was bullied a lot in high school. The youth group I went to, the kids that bullied me at school, most of them went to my church and bullied me there too. So I got it for being nerdy and the fat girl. And then I also got it because I was at church and I was on fire for the Lord, and I was there not because of the pool and the free pizza and the Coke. I was there because I wanted to know more about God, because I was hungry and I had this desire, this fire in me that just wanted more of God all the time. And then when my grandmother died, I walked away. My mom and I stopped going to church. I'm not going to get into all this, but there were other things too in my childhood that hadn't come to the surface yet that were between me and God, and I was dealing with that. And when I read this book, I was at a turning point in my life. I look back now and I see it was a turning point. I was at a point in my life, in my walk, where if there hadn't have been